Shifting Political Landscapes in Europe, Poland's Role. Welcome to this latest edition of the Blanka Rosenstiel lecture series on Poland, brought to you by the European and Eurasian Studies program at Florida International University, Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs in Miami. And let me also welcome the co-sponsors for today's webinar, the American Institute of Polish Culture, the Honorary Consulate of the Republic of Poland in Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy. I'm David Kramer, a senior fellow in the Václav Havel Program and also director of the European and Eurasian Studies program here at FIU Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. And I want to welcome all of you to today's webinar. And in doing so, let me also turn first to a brief video recording that we have from Blanka Rosenstiel herself. And just a heads up, you may need to turn up the volume to hear her well, because the recording is a little faint in the sound. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am thrilled to be here to welcome Professor Norman Davies to our lecture series, Polish series on Poland. I have known him for many, many years and have great respect for his work and his passion for Polish history. A history that is based on facts. A history that was not known outside of Poland for decades. He was the one to research the archives and tell the world about the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 and so many other historical truths. I hope that soon we can have him in Miami and organize a few lectures and book signing. It would be a real pleasure. I am also extremely pleased that our ambassador is delivering the opening remarks for the second time for the year's series. It's an honor for us, Mr. Ambassador. I hope you can count on your support and participation for more lectures in the future, and to see you in Miami again soon, and maybe at the Polonus Bowl. Thank you very much and enjoy it.
Well, to Blanka Rosenstiel, a special thanks for all of her generous support. And also let me acknowledge Beata Pacic and Lynn Schaefer at the American Institute for their great partnership with us as well. Europe has been a continent of alternating turmoil and stability over the centuries. From forcible change of borders to enormous loss of life, Europe has also helped to advance civilization in many positive directions. To understand the context of today's Europe, one has to understand its history and the changing landscape over the years. And we have the perfect person to help us in this understanding. Professor Norman Davies is a renowned historian and author of many books on Europe, including Europe, a History and Vanish Kingdoms. Professor Davies is Professor Emeritus at the University of London. He is also an Oxford graduate, an Oxford resident, an Oxford author, and an honorary fellow of Oxford College, but he is in fact Professor Emeritus of London. But before we turn to Professor Davies, let me say that we're delighted once again, as Blanka Rosenstiel indicated, to welcome back to our Polish lecture series the Ambassador of the Republic of Poland to the United States, His Excellency Piotr Wilczek. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm delighted to join everyone yet again for another lecture in the Blanka Rosenstiel lecture series on Poland, in which we will discuss the shifting political landscapes in Europe. My sincere thanks to the organizers of the event, including Florida International University, as well as the American Institute of Polish Culture in Miami, for making these discussions possible. Special thanks to Professor David Kramer of FIU, Deputy Honorary Consul Beata Pacic, and last but not least, Honorary Consul of Poland in Miami, Lady Blanka Rosenstiel. I am deeply honored to be able to introduce Dr. Norman Davies, a renowned expert in European history, Professor Emeritus of the University of London, who will share with us his insights on Poland's role within the larger European community. His best-selling books, including God's Playground, A History of Poland, Heart of Europe, A Short History of Poland, and Rising 44, The Battle for Warsaw, were instrumental in shaping public opinion in the West with regards to Polish history and culture. Europe finds itself facing a number of challenges and changes that will influence the continent's future for many generations. Some of the most pressing issues that must be addressed include the ongoing handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, its political and economic fallout, as well as the eventual recovery. The public health crisis notwithstanding, security, immigration, and energy issues continue to be at the forefront of our priorities. Historically, Poland has always identified itself as a part of Europe, shaped not only by the Church in Rome and Western art and philosophy. Poland's cultural contributions, too, including the great works of Chopin, Miłosz, Kieślowski, or Wajda, played a role in influencing Europe's artistic milieu. The fact that Poland is a member of the EU and NATO is a positive step in reasserting its rightful place on the continent and an opportunity to develop meaningful and lasting relations and cooperation with all of her partners within the transatlantic community. With all of the challenges that Europe now faces, Poland has an important role to play in transforming Europe to adapt to the realities of the 21st century. We can be sure of one thing: there will be a post-COVID world, and it is critical that we prepare for the trials that await us. Once again, I would like to congratulate Blanka Rosenstiel, Beata Paszyc, and David Kramer for organizing this wonderful series on all things Poland. And I look forward to hearing what our distinguished guest has to share with today's audience. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. We really are grateful for your taking the time to join us now for the second in this series, this academic year, and your support and participation mean a great deal. So thank you so much. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to turn the microphone over to Professor Davies.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Dzień dobry. About 40 years ago, when I first visited North America, I was invited to give a lecture at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Beautiful town, a fine university. At the time, I was the newly published author of my first book, White Eagle, Red Star, the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 20. And armed with a sheaf of notes, I was fully expecting to talk on the Polish-Soviet War, the so-called Miracle on the Vistula. I can still remember sitting on that platform, listening to the chairman who was introducing me. We are extremely pleased, the chairman said, to welcome Dr. Norman Davies, who has come all the way from London to talk to us about the Polish Schlachter in the 17th century. So, with all of 30 seconds notice, I stood up and held forth for 45 minutes on the Polish Schlachter in the 17th century. Things like this have happened and will no doubt happen again. In my lifetime, the political landscape of Europe has shifted beyond recognition. I was born in 1939, just before the Second World War. The British Empire was still the largest state in the world. The USA was still a giant awaiting to be aroused. Franco ruled Spain, Mussolini, Italy, Adolf Hitler, the Third Reich, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union. Poland had just been given a useless guarantee of its independence by Britain. During the war, I can just remember the Blitz in Manchester, the columns of tanks rolling past our house heading for Normandy. And in 1945, the madness of Victory Day, when my mother baked a great potato pie for all the neighbors, and my father put a firework in it and blew the potato pie to smithereens. After the war, I lived through the dissolution of empire, the Suez Crisis. And in 1963, I remember the application of Great Britain to join what was then the Common Market, which was vetoed by General de Gaulle. In those years after the war, I greatly remember my Willys Jeep, symbol, if you like, of American supremacy, which I bought in the year I left school for £30 from an American military base which was closing down. And in that Jeep, I toured Europe for the first time. The Cold War, of course, had already started. The Iron Curtain was in place. And one day, with my fellow Jeep riders, we drove through the Iron Curtain, were flagged down by a Soviet officer who looked in astonishment at the label on the side of the Jeep, which still read, US Army. The Cold War ended when I was aged 50, already a professor of history in the University of London. One of the first things I did was to visit the USSR, which had refused to give me a visa ever since I published that first book on 1920. And I went to visit the eastern Kresy, the eastern borderlands of former Poland, which of course had been closed to me. Poland, during my lifetime, has been transformed 6 or 7 times at least. In 1939, when I was born, it was a semi-democratic, authoritarian state run by the Senatsia regime, not of course to be confused with the totalitarian regimes on either side in the Third Reich or the Soviet Union. During the war, Poland was, if you like, a non-existent country. No state, no government, occupied first by the German Nazis and the Soviets together, then by the German Nazis alone, and then by the victorious Soviets when they returned in 1944. And it was, of course, the Golgotha of European history. One of the main components of what Timothy Snyder has called the bloodlands, the killing grounds. After the war, Poland became a powerless satellite in the totalitarian Soviet bloc. A communist regime crystallized in 1948, which was essentially run from Moscow. The Polish communists on the spot were only partly responsible for the policies that they implemented. In the 1980s, thanks to the solidarity of Lech Wałęsa and of course Pope John Paul II, Poland played a major role in the downfall of communism, not just in Poland, but in Europe in general. Since 1989 to 90, Poland has been a thriving independent state, a constitutional democracy, secure as never before as a member of NATO and the European Union. Polish history, as you will all know, spans 1,000 years and more. So if I may, I shall present you with a brief summary of the 10th century when Poland entered the historical record. In those distant days, the warring political blocs of Europe were largely based on competing religions, of which, in the 10th century I'm talking of which there were basically 5. The first was Islam, the Muslim bloc, largely confined to the West, to the Iberian Peninsula. In those days, there was no Spain, no Portugal. The peninsula was in the hands of a series of Muslim emirates. The next bloc to the west was that, of course, of Latin Christianity based on Rome, stretching from the Pyrenees to the land of the Piasts in the east. Further east was the world of Greek Christianity, based on Byzantium, the Byzantine Roman Empire. As yet, in the 10th century, the Latin and the Greek churches were still, at least nominally, united. There was one Christendom, the land of the Christian religion. Fourth on the list is the world of the pagans, which stretched right across Northern Europe from the eastern parts of England, the Danelaw, through Scandinavia, and through the activities of the Vikings, all the way through Russia to the Black Sea. Many people forget that Slavic Russia, or Rus as it was then called, was created by the joint activities of Vikings and Slavs. Further to the east, at the time when Poland converted to Christianity, was a great empire of the Khazars, a Turkic people who, in large measure, had converted to Judaism. Of course, all Jews were not subjects of the Khazars. There were Jews scattered around different parts of Europe, especially in the Muslim world, which was, compared to the Christians, relatively tolerant of Jews. But in the 10th century and earlier, the biggest concentration was there far to the east, in the land between the Black Sea and the Caspian. Incidentally, in many languages, including Turkish, the word for the Caspian Sea is the Khazar Sea, which I found out when I visited Baku for the purposes of my book of Vanish Kingdoms. In the centuries that followed, these blocks did a great deal of reshaping. The political landscape shifted constantly. For 500 years, for example, the Christian Reconquista, the reconquest of Iberia by the Christian kings and princes, gradually overwhelmed the Muslims until in 1492, the last Emir of Granada submitted. That's a date to remember. The patrons of Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand and Isabella, were also the monarchs who completed the Christian conquest of Spain. But yet, Islam had, in the meantime, invaded Europe from the east. The Ottoman Turks had warred for a couple of centuries with the Byzantine Empire until in 1453, they finally captured Constantinople, turning it into the Istanbul that we know today. So the Muslim presence continued in the other end of Europe. From the Great Schism of 1054 in the middle of the 11th century, the two elements of the United Christian Church broke up, leaving the Latin sphere of the Patriarch of Rome, the Pope, as the center of Catholicism, and the eastern part under the Patriarch of Byzantium as the sphere of orthodoxy. That schism, alas, has never been healed, and the Catholic and Orthodox worlds continue to be separate to the present day. From 1349, that's the 14th century, the Black Death plague, still more severe than the COVID virus, attacked Europe. And one of its effect was to drive almost all the Jews of Central Europe, especially from Germany, eastwards into Poland. And it's from that time that Poland became host to the biggest Jewish community in the world. A century later, 15th century, from 1453, that's the date of the conquest of Constantinople. The Patriarch of Moscow decided that he was the true heir to the Eastern Roman Empire, declared Moscow to be the third Rome, and claimed to be the superior of all Orthodox Slavs. This started a schism within the Orthodox world, which has also continued to this day, the schism between the Russian Orthodox and the other Orthodox who owe allegiance to the Patriarch of Constantinople. Another century, 16th century, we see Martin Luther starting what becomes the Protestant Reformation. a subject our ambassador knows more about than I do. But the Protestant Reformation breaks up the Catholic world into two hostile sectors. Protestantism largely in the north, Catholicism still largely in the south. So from the 16th century, we have a threefold division of the political, the religious political landscape, with the Protestant states, the Catholic states, and the Orthodox states. I'm compressing everything shamelessly and must stop. And in later centuries, religion ceased to be the main driver of politics. Yet what I have started to sketch are the basic elements of what is often called European civilization, whose roots were obviously in its religious heritage. I say European civilization, not Western civilization, as the Americans tend to do. I wonder if you know the story about Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian pacifist, who, when he first came to Europe in 1932, was buttonholed by a journalist who thrust a microphone in his face and said, Mahatma, what do you think of Western civilization? And the Mahatma said, it's a nice idea. And that says it all. Poland's role in all of this is quite considerable. And of course, would need a lecture or two in its own right just to summarize it properly. But Poland's origins from within those 5 blocks I mentioned was clearly pagan. If Mieszko was converted to Catholicism in 965-6, he had to be converted from something which existed before. And of course, that was Slavic paganism, which has survived in some ways underground right to the present day. Poland's first brush with Christianity came earlier than often recognized from the mission of Saints Cyril and Methodius from the East, i.e. from the Greek Church. But that brush with Christianity was temporary. The permanent Christian connection started with the conversion of the Piast princedom in 966, launching what became the strongest strand within Poland's identity. Jumping forward, Poland's union with Lithuania, which started in the 14th century, creating for quite some time the largest state on the European continent. That is until the Russians crossed the Urals in the 16th century. Poland's union with Lithuania created a multi-religious, a multinational, multi-linguistic community, which was quite different from what had gone before and what exists today. But the Polish-Lithuanian link was to give Poland some of its finest hours. In the 16th century, Poland's encounter with the Protestant Reformation, as Ambassador knows very well, was perhaps for 100 years one of the main features of the country. It was closely linked to the, not just to the religious sphere, but for example, to the literary sphere, when the Polish language was mobilized in ways that still hadn't happened, for example, in Germany. As part of that Reformation period, the so-called Confederation of Warsaw in 1573, the event when Polish leaders agreed among themselves not to go to war with each other in the way that was happening at the time in France in the wars of religion, gave Poland an unusual I was going to say veneer, that's perhaps unkind, gave Poland an unusual element, if not of deep tolerance, definitely of toleration, which was fairly unique in its day. Then comes, in the 17th century, come the Swedish Wars and the triumph of the Counter-Reformation. The Swedes being Protestants, strengthened the Catholic connections of Poland in resistance to their depredations, and the Counter-Reformation triumphed. Incidentally, my mother-in-law, who came from Lvov, but the family came from the district of Tarnów, had a Swedish name, descending from Swedish soldiers who were abandoned in the depths of Poland in the 1650s. In that same 17th century, Poland was one of the countries which adopted the title of the Antemurale Christianitatis, the bulwark of Christendom, in its long drawn out struggles with the Ottomans. And this again was a powerful experience which is still remembered today. The Siege of Vienna in 1683, when King John Sobieski, with his winged hussars, charged down from the Kallenberg Hill and dispersed the camp of the Ottoman Sultan, was one of the great moments, not only of Poland's history, but indeed of Europe's. Lastly, I mentioned briefly the word Polakatolik, the theory basically that Polishness is indivisible from Catholicism, Polakatolik. This was very much a slogan of the late 19th century, early 20th century, when the Nationalist Party, the Narodowcy, got going and was strongly opposed to the multinational and multi-religious society of the country. At this point, hopefully after the middle of the lecture, I'd like to introduce you briefly to two relevant ideas. The first of them is summed up by the title of a book I wrote called Vanish Kingdoms. The idea that all political organisms, like all human beings, are mortal. They are born, they have a lifespan, which is either long or short, and then they die, they become extinct, they cease to exist. And one of the sort of basic reasons why the political landscapes are constantly changing is that states are always falling off the edge, ceasing to exist, falling off the map, I wanted to say. The best example, without doubt, is that of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which I began to talk about earlier. Created in 1569 by the Act of Union at Lublin, it enjoyed a lifespan of 233 years until it died, or rather was murdered during the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century. This is the idea of a vanished kingdom, which inspired me to explore some 20 other examples, which stretched from obscure Welsh kingdoms in the British Isles to places in the Balkans, in Scandinavia, and of course, in Galicia and Lithuania. Another prime example of kingdoms, republics, empires that evaporated, and within our own memory, was that of course, of the USSR, the Soviet Union. For several decades, absolutely the largest state on earth, created in 1923, not in 1917, as many people say. One of the reasons it was created was the defeat of Soviet Russia in the Battle of Warsaw. The Soviet Union, 1923 to 1991, and I can remember it like as yesterday. The Soviet Union was there one day and it had gone the next. And I had the experience when visiting Lvov or Lviv in Ukraine of seeing the statue of Lenin demolished, much as the statue of Saddam Hussein was demolished later in Iraq. Since 1991, at least 2 European states have vanished, changing the landscape which they left. One of them was Czechoslovakia, which split up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The other, of course, was Yugoslavia at the end of the Yugoslavian wars. And the big question today is which will be next? I long thought that Belgium might be the next. Belgium is fought over, if that's the right word, between Dutch-speaking Flemings and French-speaking Walloons. It went several years without a government, but it has kept going, and I would now put my money on the next example being the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which Brexit, even today, and I mean literally today, is pushing to the very brink of its existence. The other idea which I wanted just to mention is the metaphor of the avalanche as an explanation for historical change. In Florida, you probably don't know what an avalanche is. I don't think there are many snowfields in Florida. The avalanches occur, of course, in the Alps, but also in the Rockies and the Andes, and wherever Floridians have to go to see one. But I think the metaphor is very apt. Just to remind you, up in the snowy mountains, the frozen snowfields look absolutely stable. They're frozen solid. And they look like glaciers, as though they simply exist for millennia. So you have the illusion of stability to start with. Then the sun shines, the water on the surface melts, and it runs down the cracks and disappears. In the night, the snowfield freezes again and again looks stable. All the changes are happening under the surface. You can't see it, but the cumulative effects of the drops of meltwater undermine the frozen snowfield until the point is reached when there's a crack like a gunshot, and the sheer weight of the frozen snow pushes the melted under materials away, and the whole massive snowfield roars down the valley, killing anything in its path. And this is, I think, how historical change usually happens. Most countries go through a period of apparent stability. A regime of some sort establish itself. And you have stability or apparent stability. All the changes that are happening, political, economic, cultural, social, are happening under the surface. Small changes, but they're happening every minute of every day until they reach the point where the whole structure can no longer hold together. And whoosh, in one day or 1 hour, regimes are overthrown, crises erupt, and one moves on to something else. And this, I think, is a very good way of explaining to people who are wondering what's going to happen. And the answer always is, you can't see what is happening today, but you'll see the consequences when whatever exists will be swept away. And everything that exists, sooner or later, will be swept away. I saw the words recent decades and Poland in the future on the poster with some alarm, since these are topics really beyond my ken. If one wants to hear about contemporary affairs, one invites a journalist or perhaps a political scientist, and you try to decipher their gobbledygook. If you want to know about the future, you employ an astrologer. For myself, I am reminded of the Chinese Premier Chu Enlai, who was foreign minister and head of state, who was once asked what he thought about the French Revolution. And he said, it's too soon to know. And that's like spoken like a good historian. Historians need to know the end of a story before they begin to analyze it, which makes us hesitant to intervene in current affairs. However, not to sidestep the issue completely, I can set out the main shifts in the European landscape that have happened since the end of the millennium. The rise of the Russia of Vladimir Putin begins, actually, I think in 1999. Putin, who rescued Russia from disintegration, but has moved on to establish a very expansive and aggressive regime. Then there's the rise, the still greater rise of China, the world's new second superpower, which has a Belt and Road Initiative, which is affecting every country in Europe. Then you have the Eurozone crisis, an economic crisis caused by the imbalance between the states in the north and the states in the south, and giving rise, after a few years, to the notorious Greek debt crisis of 2009. The Eurozone crisis, incidentally, has been put aside, but is still very much in danger of returning. In 2004, we had the European Union's greatest expansion, 10 new members in one go, of which Poland was the largest. In that same year, 2004, we had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and its many consequences, including an ongoing war with Russia and in 2014, the annexation of Crimea. Next, we have the strange and uneven story of so-called populism, started, I think, by Jean-Marie Le Pen in France and Viktor Orban in Hungary. I recall that I once sat on a committee that gave Viktor Orban a scholarship to come to Oxford. Whether that was a good move or not, I leave you to decide. But there's a group of countries, including, of course, the United Kingdom, which have been affected by movements of the same ilk. And finally, the ongoing crisis of immigration, of not just immigration, unregulated mass immigration, which came to a peak in 2015, but is again likely to return. Oh, and yes, and there's another change in the landscape threatened by a number of separatist movements, of which Catalonia is one and Scotland is another. Poland, of course, has a stake in most of these issues, but how to deal with them is another matter. All I can do is to state the obvious. Poland is a middle-sized country, not a small country, and not the biggest country. It's fifth in the league table of 27 European Union members, but it's an independent sovereign state and belongs to two clubs, organizations of democratic states, NATO and the European Union. At any particular moment, Poland, like all other countries, has the choice either of acting independently and taking the consequences, or of acting collectively within either NATO or the European Union. I myself, as a Honorary Professor Emeritus, have no influence whatsoever on which choice is taken. Thank you very much.
Norman, thank you very much. That was a tour de force and tour de horizon. So thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. What I would like to do is to invite viewers to send in any questions they may have. We don't have a lot of time. There was one that came in, if we can sort out right off the top, and it was from Leszek Paulek, who asked, based on something he thought he heard you say early on in your presentation, wondering if you just said Poland had no government during World War II. He says that's a terrible mistake. There was a government in exile, just like many other countries, France included. So if you could just clarify that right off the top, that would be great.
Well, exactly. I don't know whether it's a slip of the tongue or not getting around to it. Of course, I've written extensively about the government in exile. What I was indicating that Poland had no government in place in Poland. And quite often, Poles are reprimanded for doing things or not doing others, as if they had any choice. Most occupied European countries, occupied by the German Nazis, like France or Norway or Denmark, did have governments. And those governments were responsible for different measures of collaboration. There was no such Polish government in Poland. And Poles were deprived of any guidance by their own authorities. They were left to the less than tender mercy of these very hostile totalitarian neighbors. So yes, Polish government in exile was a very honorable and government which continued in exile actually till 1990. And if you want to read more about it, you look at my book, Trail of Hope, about the Anders Army, which was the one of the military forces which owed loyalty to the government in exile. So thank you for the question. Thank you.
Sure. And let me turn to a few others that we have here. Miriam Vulis asks about if you could say a little bit about the Soviet-Polish War. And then there are a few other questions about a few more recent developments.
Well, you're asking for it by mentioning the Soviet-Polish War. I've written about it at length. I'll try and be short. It's in modern Poland. It's obviously called, frequently called the Polish Bolshevik War. When I was young, it used to be called the Wojna Polsko-Radziecka. It went on for 2 years. The war in 1919 was largely a war over territory, of trying to define frontiers. But in 1920, it took on a very ideological nature because Lenin and the Bolsheviks decided it was time for them to export their revolution from Russia to Europe, and in the first place to Germany. The Bolsheviks had committed a cardinal sin of Marxism, of launching a revolution in a country, Russia, where the proletariat, the industrial proletariat, was very small. And Marx had always said that Russia was the last place in which you should launch a revolution. So in 1920, Lenin sent his Red Army westwards in the hope of reaching the more developed countries of Europe. And to get there, they had to march across Poland. They greatly miscalculated the resources and patriotism of the Poles, and they suffered the most decisive defeat the Red Army has ever met with.
Great.
August 1920. Yeah.
Yes. We've got a few questions related to immigration and the refugee crisis, if I can try to combine them. What is Poland's role? One asks, isn't the rise of Islam within Europe as a result of immigration another major force affecting Europe today? And there was one more about comment on the effect of various waves of immigration out of Poland. If you could just touch on those briefly.
Well, that's a complicated story. Of course, you say the rise of Islam. Islam has been around for quite a long time. It's not a new feature, although the presence of Islam has changed a lot. Where do we? The link between Islam and immigration is not entirely accurate. Of course, one stream of immigration to Europe has come from Muslim countries, in particular from Syria. During the Syrian war from 2012, one of the great streams of refugees and immigrants came from Syria, but the larger numbers are coming from elsewhere, from wherever, West Africa. The immigrants coming across the Mediterranean are very often from West Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. As for Poland's role in that, the policy of the European Union, which has been rather unsuccessful, was based on the idea that every country should take a quota of immigrants to lessen the burden for everybody. That has not worked out. Poland was one of the countries, but not the only one, to dissent on that policy. And as you know, Germany in 2015 decided for a time to accept anybody who could get there. And this has caused quite a lot of problems. Fortunately, Germany seems to have, in general, managed, and the immigration, the unregulated immigration has subsided. It's quite a problem in England. There are every day dozens or hundreds of people trying to paddle their way across the English Channel, and nobody quite knows how to deal with it. As for emigration out of Poland, in 2004, Great Britain was the only country to signal that any of the new members could travel to Great Britain and work without special visas. And so you've got this great influx, especially of Poles, not only Poles, but the Poles were the biggest lot. So that now in England, Polish is the second language. There are more Polish speakers in England than there are Welsh speakers, which is quite interesting for me. But who knows? I am on the side of the argument which says that immigrants have filled a very necessary gap in Great Britain, and generally speaking, immigrants have been welcome. Not all British people would say that, but I think it's similar in America, isn't it, with the unregulated immigration over the Mexican frontier. So in a way, it's a world problem of coming from the discrepancies between the poorer South and the richer North.
So we're going to take about 5 more minutes with apologies that we're running a little over, but we've got a lot of questions here and I'm not going to get to all of them. So my apologies to those sending them in. But my colleague Marcus Thiel asks a quick question. What was your favorite book to research and write, and why?
Oh, I don't know. It's like having children. Your first book is like your first child, and the White Eagle Red Star about the War of 1919-20, which is still in print, incidentally. Nearly 50 years later, has given me a great deal of enjoyment. I should also mention Vanish Kingdoms, I think in some ways is the most enterprising book that I've written. And I adopted the habit of trying to visit all the places that I was writing about, which adds special spice. The book after that, which is called Beneath Another Sky, in Poland it's Na końcu świata. I literally went all the way around the globe and visited, I think, 17 different countries, and then wrote up the history afterwards. I think the combination of visiting places, getting to know people on the spot, together with researching their history, is the ideal combination. It's not healthy if the historian sits in his room or in the archives looking for everything from books. Books are, and archives are obviously part of the game, but knowing the countries, knowing the people, seeing them with your own eyes, talking to them individually, this creates an entirely different sort of emotional context to the work of a writer.
Ted Kontek, another colleague, FIU, asks, how do you view the value wars in the EU between some of the new Central European entrants to the EU and the traditional Western EU members? Do you think that differences in approach to abortion, LGBT issues, and multiculturalism and other issues lead to further friction within the EU? And then if I could tack onto that, and this will be the last one, I'll ask you to put on your astrologist hat, as you said. Lucia Cannon asks, what is your judgment of where Poland is going right now in view of the forces you've identified?
Oh gosh. About the culture wars, I wouldn't agree that they are being fought largely between, if you like, the East and Central European countries and Western European countries, they're very much alive within all the countries of Europe, not least in the United Kingdom. The division is not between Poles and Hungarians and whoever, Slovaks and French, British and Germans. No, all these countries have their share of the culture wars. And I don't see any easy solution. As for where Poland is going, I hope the answer is nowhere. As somebody who has both a British and a Polish passport, I'm always comparing the two countries with which I have connections. And I have to say, whatever problems Poland may have, Poland is not like to go anywhere anytime soon. On the other hand, alas, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is, in my view, about to break up. Brexit is driving it over the precipice. And we'll see what happens this week, but we're getting very close to disaster. And I first wrote about that about 30 years ago, when I began to look at the pillars of Britishness, and I wrote a big book called The Isles, and I could see that many of the foundations of the British state, which had been in place since 1707, when England joined with Scotland, are now crumbling. And God save us, but we're standing on the edge of disaster. Poland, fortunately, is not.
Great, exactly. Professor Norman Davies, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you join us today. This has been a phenomenal session. We had a lot more questions that we didn't have time to get to, but incredibly grateful for you taking the time to join us today, and hope you will return as well. So let me just wrap up this session and also thank Ambassador Vilcek for joining us for Shifting Political Landscapes in Europe, Poland's Role, which has been the latest webinar in the Blanka Rosenstiel lecture series on Poland, brought to you by the European and Eurasian Studies program at FIU's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. I'm David Kramer here in Miami. Thank you all for joining us. Norman.